Her worn sneakers squeaked against the polished marble floor as she walked into the lecture hall. No designer backpack, no sorority letters, no expensive laptop, just a simple black hoodie and the kind of quiet confidence that made people look twice. The students stared, then whispered, "She must be lost. Probably some scholarship kid who didn't know where she belonged." Their snickers echoed through the pristine corridors of Riverside University's crisis management building, mocking her thrift store clothes, her silence, her very presence. But what they didn't know was that in 72 hours, Black Hawk helicopters would land on their campus lawn with her call sign painted on the side, and every assumption they'd made would shatter like glass. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. At 24, Alex Chen didn't look like someone who had commanded aerial missions over hostile territory. Her black hoodie was faded at the edges, pulled from a discount rack 3 states away. Her jeans were clean but unremarkable, the kind you'd find at any department store. Her sneakers had seen better days, their white surfaces now a dull gray from countless miles of walking. She carried a single notebook and a ballpoint pen that she'd picked up from a gas station counter. No iPad, no MacBook, no noise-canceling headphones that seemed standard issue for every other student at Riverside University. She hadn't stepped foot in a classroom in over 6 years, not since the day she'd walked across a different stage, in a different uniform, accepting commendation for service that most people would never fully understand. That was before the mission that changed everything, before the silence became her armor, before she traded her flight suit for civilian clothes and decided that some chapters of life were better left closed. Now, on this crisp October morning in upstate New York, Alex was starting over. Not as Captain Alexandra Chen, callsign Phoenix, but simply as a graduate student hoping to blend into the background of academic anonymity. Riverside University wasn't just any school. It was where the children of senators, CEOs, and ambassadors came to polish their resumes before stepping into the family business. The campus stretched across 500 acres of manicured lawns and ivy-covered buildings that whispered old money and older connections. The crisis management program was housed in the newest building on campus, all glass and steel, funded by a tech billionaire whose daughter needed a degree that sounded impressive at cocktail parties. As Alex entered Morrison Hall, she immediately felt the weight of 1,000 assumptions. The other students moved in clusters, their conversations peppered with references to summer internships at Fortune 500 companies and spring breaks in the Hamptons. Designer bags hung from shoulders like badges of honor. The latest smartphones captured every moment for Instagram stories that would be seen by followers who moved in the same rarefied circles. Alex found a seat in the back corner of Lecture Hall 3. The chairs were the kind of high-tech ergonomic marvels that probably cost more than most people's monthly rent. She sat down quietly, opened her simple notebook, and waited. Around her, the pre-class chatter continued. "Did you see the new girl?" The voice belonged to Jessica Hamilton, easily identifiable by the way conversations seemed to orbit around her. Jessica's blonde hair was styled in the kind of effortless waves that required an hour and $200 worth of products. Her navy blazer bore the subtle logo of a designer whose waiting list was longer than most people's bucket lists. "Did you see the new girl?" The voice belonged to Jessica Hamilton, easily identifiable by the way conversations seemed to orbit around her. Jessica's blonde hair was styled in the kind of effortless waves that required an hour and $200 worth of products. Her navy blazer bore the subtle logo of a designer whose waiting list was longer than most people's bucket lists. "Did you see the new girl?" The comment drew laughter from her circle. Brandon Torres, whose father owned half the commercial real estate in downtown Manhattan, leaned back in his chair with a smirk. "Maybe she's here on some kind of charity admission program. You know how the university loves their diversity statistics." Riley Matthews, a senator's daughter whose every move had been photographed for society pages since birth, pulled out her phone. "Should we get a picture? This might be the most interesting thing that happens in Morrison's class all semester." Alex heard every word. She'd been trained to listen, to observe, to catalog details that others missed. She noted the designer labels, the practiced confidence, the way they spoke about money and influence as casually as others discussed the weather. But she didn't react. Reaction would draw attention, and attention was the last thing she wanted. Professor David Mitchell entered the classroom with the kind of theatrical flair that suggested he'd been waiting in the hallway for maximum dramatic impact. At 52, he was the kind of academic who wore his PhD like a crown and his consulting contracts like royal robes. His suit was impeccably tailored, his silver hair perfectly styled, his smile practiced and professional. "Welcome, future leaders," he announced, his voice carrying easily through the lecture hall's sound system. "Crisis management isn't just about handling problems. It's about having the authority and presence to take command when others falter." His eyes swept the room, pausing on the familiar faces in the front rows. These were the students whose families funded university buildings and whose recommendations could open doors that talent alone never could. Then his gaze found Alex in the back corner, and something shifted in his expression. "Miss," he consulted his tablet, frowning slightly. "Chen, is it? You seem to have found yourself quite far from the center of things. In crisis management, visibility is everything. Perhaps you'd prefer a seat where you can be properly seen and heard." The suggestion carried the weight of a command, but Alex didn't move. She simply looked up from her notebook and met his gaze steadily. "I'm fine here, Professor. Thank you."
The response was polite but firm, delivered without the deference that Mitchell clearly expected. A ripple of whispers ran through the classroom. Jessica exchanged glances with her friends, eyebrows raised in a mixture of surprise and amusement. Mitchell's practiced smile tightened almost imperceptibly. "Very well. Though I should mention that participation is a significant component of your final grade. It's difficult to participate effectively from the shadows." "I understand," Alex replied, her tone unchanged. For the next hour, Professor Mitchell launched into his opening lecture about leadership theory and crisis response protocols. He spoke with the confidence of someone who had read extensively about situations he'd never actually faced, whose understanding of crisis came from case studies and simulations rather than the kind of real-world experience that left permanent marks on a person's soul. Alex took notes in her simple notebook, her handwriting neat and economical. She didn't raise her hand, she didn't ask questions, she didn't offer insights gleaned from textbooks or internships. She simply absorbed information with the kind of focused attention that would have impressed anyone who knew what to look for. But the other students weren't looking for competence. They were looking for entertainment, and Alex's quiet presence in her discount store clothes provided the perfect target for their amusement. During the break, Jessica made her move. She approached Alex's corner with the kind of confident stride that comes from never having been told no about anything that mattered. "I don't think we've been properly introduced," she said, her voice carrying just far enough for her friends to hear. "I'm Jessica Hamilton. My father's the Hamilton of Hamilton and Associates. You might have seen our name on a few buildings around campus." Alex looked up from her notes. "Alex Chen." "Chen," Jessica repeated as if testing the sound. "That's interesting. Are you local, or did you travel far for the Riverside experience?" "I'm from California originally," Alex replied, her tone neutral. "California? How exotic. And what brings you to our little program? Family business, or are you more of a self-made situation?" The question hung in the air like a challenge. Around them, other conversations had quieted as students tuned in to what was clearly developing into some form of social theater. Alex closed her notebook slowly and stood. She was several inches shorter than Jessica, but there was something in her posture, a kind of grounded stillness, that made the height difference irrelevant. "I'm here to learn," she said simply. "To learn?" Jessica laughed, the sound bright and artificial. "How refreshingly honest. Most of us are here to network, to make the right connections, to position ourselves for the next phase of our careers. But learning, that's very pure of you." Brandon had moved closer, phone in hand. "Jessica's just being friendly," he said, with a grin that suggested anything but friendliness. We like to look out for each other here. Make sure everyone feels included. Alex's eyes flicked to the phone, then back to Jessica's face. For just a moment, something flickered in her expression, a kind of recognition, as if she'd seen this exact dynamic play out in very different circumstances. "That's thoughtful of you," she said, picking up her notebook and pen. "If you'll excuse me, I have another class." She walked toward the door with the same quiet confidence she had entered with, leaving Jessica and her audience slightly off balance. They'd been prepared for defensiveness, for embarrassment, for some kind of reaction they could build on. Instead, they'd been met with a calm that felt almost professional. As Alex left the building, she passed a bulletin board covered with announcements for internships at prestigious firms, study abroad programs in European capitals, and networking events with alumni who moved in circles where real power lived and breathed. None of it applied to her. None of it mattered. What Jessica Hamilton and her friends didn't know, what Professor Mitchell couldn't have guessed, was that Alex Chen had already lived through more real crises than most people would face in 10 lifetimes. She'd made decisions under pressure that had saved lives and ended others. She'd commanded respect from people who measured worth in terms far more serious than designer labels or family connections. But that was a different life, and she had left it behind for reasons that still woke her up at night sometimes. Now she was just a student trying to find a new way forward one quiet day at a time. She had no way of knowing that in 72 hours, her old life would come looking for her in the most dramatic way possible, and that every assumption her classmates had made would crumble in the space of a few earth-shaking minutes. For now, though, she was just Alex Chen, walking across a campus where she didn't quite fit, carrying a notebook full of thoughts that no one else would understand, heading toward a future she was still trying to define. The afternoon sun caught her face as she stepped outside, highlighting the kind of quiet strength that comes from having survived things that would break most people. Behind her, in the climate-controlled comfort of Morrison Hall, her classmates were already crafting the story of their encounter with the strange, quiet girl who didn't know her place. They had no idea that before the week was over, they would learn exactly who Alex Chen really was and why Black Hawk helicopters carried her name.
The next morning brought the kind of crisp autumn air that made Riverside University's campus look like a postcard. Maple trees lined the walkways in brilliant shades of gold and crimson, their leaves crunching under the feet of students hurrying to their first classes. For most of them, it was just another Tuesday in their carefully curated college experience. For Alex Chen, it was the beginning of something she'd hoped to avoid entirely. She arrived at Morrison Hall 15 minutes early, as was her habit. Military training dies hard, and punctuality had been drilled into her bones long before she'd learned to fly helicopters through hostile airspace. The building was mostly empty, save for a few maintenance workers and an early-arriving professor clutching a coffee cup like a lifeline. Alex found the same seat she'd occupied the day before. Back corner, clear sightlines to all exits, minimal attention. She opened her notebook and reviewed the previous day's notes, her handwriting neat and economical. While other students filled pages with rambling observations and doodles, Alex's notes were precise, tactical, focused on the essential information that might actually matter. The quiet didn't last long. "Look who's back!" Jessica Hamilton's voice rang out as she entered the lecture hall with her usual entourage. Today, she wore a cream-colored cashmere sweater that probably cost more than most people's monthly salary, paired with dark jeans that had been professionally distressed to look effortlessly expensive. Her hair was perfectly tousled, her makeup flawless despite the early hour. Brandon Torres followed close behind, his designer messenger bag slung casually over his shoulder. "I was wondering if she'd come back after yesterday," he said loud enough for Alex to hear. "That was pretty awkward." Riley Matthews pulled out her phone, positioning it for the perfect angle. "Should we document this? For posterity?" "Oh, definitely," Jessica replied, her voice dripping with fake enthusiasm. "Future crisis managers need to learn how to handle all kinds of situations." More students filtered in, and word spread quickly through the pre-class chatter. The quiet girl in the back corner, the one with the thrift store clothes and the attitude problem, was back for round 2. It was better than reality TV.
Alex kept her eyes on her notebook, but she was hyper-aware of every conversation, every glance, every subtle shift in the room's energy. In another life, this kind of situational awareness had kept her team alive. Here, it just made her acutely conscious of how much she didn't belong. Professor Mitchell arrived with his usual theatrical flair, but today there was something different in his demeanor. He'd clearly heard about yesterday's exchange, and his eyes found Alex immediately as he entered the room. "Good morning, future leaders," he announced, setting his leather briefcase on the podium with deliberate precision. "Today we'll be discussing leadership presence and the importance of commanding respect in high-stakes situations." He clicked to his first slide, a photograph of a corporate boardroom filled with men in expensive suits. Leadership isn't just about having good ideas. It's about having the credibility to make others listen to those ideas. And credibility, unfortunately, often begins with perception. Jessica raised her hand. "Professor Mitchell, are you saying that appearance actually matters in crisis situations? That seems superficial." Mitchell smiled, clearly pleased with the setup. "Excellent question, Ms. Hamilton. While we might wish it weren't the case, first impressions do matter enormously. When people are scared, confused, or under pressure, they look for leaders who appear confident, competent, and in control. They need to trust that the person giving orders has earned the right to do so." His gaze drifted meaningfully toward Alex's corner. "Someone dressed inappropriately for the situation, or who seems unprepared or out of place, may struggle to establish that crucial initial credibility. Fair or not, it's reality." The message was clear, and it landed exactly as intended. Whispers rippled through the classroom as students turned to Alex, who sat perfectly still, her expression unchanged. "Of course," Mitchell continued, "true leaders understand the importance of professional presentation. They invest in their image because they understand that leadership is, in many ways, a performance." Brandon leaned over to his friend Marcus Kim and whispered just loud enough to be heard. "Some people didn't get the memo about the dress code for success." Marcus, whose family owned a chain of luxury hotels, glanced back at Alex and shook his head. "It's like she's not even trying. Does she think this is community college?" Riley had her phone out again, subtly recording. "This is golden content," she murmured to Jessica. "The contrast is perfect." As the lecture continued, Professor Mitchell seemed to take particular pleasure in making examples that felt pointed and personal. When discussing the importance of executive presence, his eyes found Alex. When talking about earning respect through professional standards, he glanced her way. When emphasizing the need to fit in with organizational culture, his gaze lingered meaningfully on her corner of the room. Alex absorbed it all without reaction. She had faced down enemy fire with less composure than she was showing now. But this was different. This was personal in a way that combat was never. Combat was professional. People trying to kill you because of your uniform, your mission, your country. This was people attacking her as a person, dismissing her worth based on nothing more than assumptions and appearances. During the break, the attacks became more direct.
"I love your aesthetic," Riley said, approaching Alex's seat with her phone held at just the right angle. "It's very authentic, very real world." "Thank you," Alex replied evenly, not looking up from her notes. "Where do you shop? I'm always looking for more budget-friendly options. For charity work, of course." Jessica joined the circle that was forming around Alex's corner. "Riley, don't be rude. I'm sure Alex has her reasons for her fashion choices. Maybe she's making a statement about consumer culture. Very deep, very meaningful. Or maybe," Brandon added with a grin, "she's just being practical. Why spend money on clothes when you're probably not going to be here very long anyway?" The comment hung in the air like a challenge. Several students had pulled out their phones now, recording what they clearly expected to be Alex's breaking point. The back corner of the lecture hall had become a stage, and Alex was the unwilling star of their entertainment. Alex closed her notebook slowly and looked up at the circle of faces surrounding her. For just a moment, something flickered in her eyes, a hardness that hadn't been there before, a glimpse of someone who had made life and death decisions under pressure that these students couldn't imagine. But when she spoke, her voice was calm and controlled. "I appreciate your concern about my wardrobe choices. I'll be sure to give your feedback all the consideration it deserves." The response was perfectly polite and completely devastating. Jessica's smile faltered for just a moment as she tried to process whether she'd just been insulted or thanked. "We're just trying to help. This is a competitive program, and first impressions matter so much. Professor Mitchell just explained that." "He did. And I'm sure your first impressions are exactly what you want them to be." Again, the comment could have been sincere or cutting, and the ambiguity clearly frustrated Jessica. She was used to reactions she could build on: anger, embarrassment, defensiveness. Alex's calm was like trying to fight smoke. Brandon tried a different approach. "So, what's your background, Alex? Where did you do your undergrad?" "Various places." "Various places? That's vague. What did you study?" "Different things." Riley laughed. "She's very mysterious, isn't she? Maybe she's got some big secret she's hiding." If only they knew, Alex thought, but her expression didn't change. "We should probably focus on Professor Mitchell's lecture. I think he is about to start again." As if summoned, Mitchell returned to the podium, and the circle of students reluctantly dispersed back to their seats. But Alex could feel their eyes on her throughout the rest of the class, could sense the texts being sent and the social media posts being crafted. By the time class ended, she'd become a minor celebrity on the Riverside University's social media landscape. #ThriftStoreGirl was trending in the university's private Instagram circles. TikTok videos analyzing her aesthetic choices were racking up views. Group chats were buzzing with speculation about her background, her finances, her right to be there at all. Alex walked out of Morrison Hall the same way she'd walked in, quietly, calmly, with the kind of dignified composure that came from having survived much worse than college social dynamics. She had no way of knowing that Jessica Hamilton was already planning something much more public and much more humiliating for tomorrow's class. And she definitely had no way of knowing that in less than 48 hours, every assumption her classmates had made about her would be shattered by the arrival of 2 Black Hawk helicopters carrying a message that would change everything.
Wednesday morning arrived with the kind of gray, overcast sky that seemed to match the mood brewing in Morrison Hall. Alex Chen walked across campus with her usual quiet stride, unaware that her every step was being documented by at least 3 different phones hidden behind textbooks and coffee cups. The #ThriftStoreGirl hashtag had exploded overnight, spreading beyond Riverside University's private social circles and into the broader campus community. Jessica Hamilton had been busy. Very busy. She'd spent the previous evening in her perfectly appointed dorm room, more like a luxury apartment, really, complete with a kitchenette and a view of the campus lake, crafting what she called her social awareness campaign. To her followers, she presented it as an educational opportunity about class consciousness and privilege. To her inner circle, she was more honest about her intentions. "Sometimes people need to be shown where they belong," she'd explained to Riley and Brandon during their late-night strategy session. "It's actually a kindness when you think about it. Better she learns now than after she's wasted years trying to fit into a world that will never accept her." The plan was elegant in its cruelty. Jessica had convinced Professor Mitchell, through a combination of charm, family connections, and strategic donations her father had made to the university, to assign a group presentation project. The topic? Leadership in crisis situations, a case study analysis. Teams would be randomly assigned, presentations would be filmed for the university's online learning platform, and grades would count for 30% of the semester total. Of course, the team assignments weren't quite as random as they appeared. Alex arrived at her usual seat to find a small package waiting on her desk. Inside was a carefully curated care package from an anonymous donor, a used blazer from a thrift store, complete with a receipt showing it cost $3.99, a tube of drugstore lipstick in an unflattering shade, and a note written in carefully disguised handwriting. Thought you might need some help fitting in, from a concerned classmate. Around the room, students were pretending not to watch as Alex discovered the package. Phones were recording her reaction from multiple angles. The entire morning had been choreographed like a reality TV show, with Alex as the unwitting star. She examined the contents without expression, then placed everything back in the box and set it aside. No reaction, no embarrassment, no anger. Just that same infuriating calm that made Jessica's perfectly manicured hands clench into fists. Professor Mitchell called the class to order with unusual enthusiasm. "Today we begin our major group project," he announced, clicking to a slide showing team assignments. "These presentations will test your ability to work collaboratively under pressure, a crucial skill for any crisis management professional." Alex found her name grouped with 3 others: Jessica Hamilton, Brandon Torres, and Riley Matthews. The assignment was no coincidence, and everyone in the room knew it. Whispers and barely suppressed laughter rippled through the lecture hall. "Your topic," Professor Mitchell continued, his eyes finding Alex's team, "is military leadership principles in corporate crisis management. You'll need to research actual military case studies and present how those principles apply to civilian leadership challenges." The irony was so thick it was almost tangible. Jessica's smile was sharp enough to cut steel as she turned to look at Alex. "Well, this should be interesting," she said loud enough for the front rows to hear. "I hope our teammate has done some research on military topics. It's such a specialized field." Brandon nodded sagely. "Very specialized. You really need authentic experience to understand military leadership, not something you can just Wikipedia or pretend to know about." Riley was already recording with her phone. "This is going to be such a learning experience for all of us, especially for team members who might be out of their depth." The rest of the class period was devoted to team planning time, which in practice meant 45 minutes of public humiliation disguised as academic collaboration. Jessica, Brandon, and Riley huddled around Alex's corner seat, their voices carrying throughout the room as they discussed their project strategy. "Obviously, I'll handle the corporate leadership section," Jessica announced, her tone businesslike and condescending. "My father's company has dealt with several major crises, and I've sat in on board meetings where these decisions were made." "I can cover the presentation technology and visual design," Brandon added. "My internship at Torres Media Group gave me experience with high-level corporate presentations." "And I'll handle the research methodology and academic citations," Riley chimed in. "My mother's position at the State Department has given me access to some excellent military leadership resources." They all turned to look at Alex expectantly. "So, what exactly will you be contributing?" Jessica asked with false sweetness. "Do you have any relevant experience we should know about?" Alex looked up from the notebook where she'd been quietly taking notes about the project requirements. "I can handle the military case studies," she said simply. The suggestion was met with barely contained laughter. Brandon actually snorted. "Military case studies? That's pretty ambitious. These are real operations we're talking about, not something you can just Wikipedia." "Exactly," Riley agreed, her phone still recording. "This is going to be such a learning experience for all of us, especially for team members who might be out of their depth."
Jessica leaned forward, her voice taking on the tone of someone explaining something to a child. "Maybe you could help with general research support instead? Finding books, organizing materials, that kind of thing. Very important support work." Around them, other teams were engaged in genuine collaboration, sharing ideas and dividing responsibilities based on actual strengths and interests. But Alex's corner had become a theater of social domination, with every exchange carefully calculated to reinforce the hierarchy Jessica was determined to establish. "I think I can manage the military analysis," Alex replied calmly. "Can you, though?" Jessica's mask slipped slightly, revealing genuine irritation.
This isn't a game, Alex. Our grades depend on this presentation. We can't afford to have someone in over their head trying to tackle the most technical section. She's right, Brandon said, pulling out his own phone to join the documentation. Military leadership principles aren't something you can just figure out from reading a few articles. You need real understanding, real insight into how these operations actually work. Alex closed her notebook and looked at each of them in turn. For just a moment, something flickered in her eyes, a kind of recognition, as if she were seeing them clearly for the first time. "I understand your concerns," she said quietly, "but I think I can handle it." "Handle it?" Riley laughed, the sound sharp and cruel. "Alex, we're talking about analyzing actual military operations, combat leadership, life and death decision-making. These aren't abstract concepts." "No, they're not." Something in her tone made Jessica pause. There was a quality to Alex's voice, a kind of certainty that didn't match the image of the overwhelmed scholarship student they'd been constructing. But the moment passed and Jessica's confidence returned. "Look, we're trying to help you here. Take on something more manageable. Maybe you could handle the bibliography? Make sure all our sources are properly formatted?" The suggestion was met with approving nods from Brandon and Riley. It was perfect. Give the charity case busy work while the real contributors handled the substantial content. Alex packed her notebook into her simple backpack. "I'll work on my section. We can compare notes next class." As she walked away, the three of them exchanged triumphant glances. Jessica was already composing her next social media post in her head. Some people really don't know their limitations. This project is going to be educational. What none of them realized was that Alex Chen knew more about military leadership, combat operations, and life and death decision-making than all of their professors combined. She'd lived it, breathed it, commanded it in situations that would have left them paralyzed with fear. But they would learn that soon enough. In 36 hours, Black Hawk helicopters would land on their pristine campus, and every assumption they'd made about the quiet girl in the thrift store clothes would crumble like a house of cards in a hurricane.
Thursday morning brought the kind of artificial energy that only comes from a carefully orchestrated social media campaign reaching its peak momentum. The #ThriftStoreGirl hashtag had evolved overnight, spawning derivative content across every platform Riverside University students use to document their privileged lives. TikTok videos analyzing Alex's aesthetic choices had thousands of views. Instagram stories dissected her body language frame by frame. Even LinkedIn, where future CEOs went to practice their corporate personas, buzzed with professional development posts about the importance of executive presence. Jessica Hamilton had become something of a campus influencer overnight, her follower count climbing as students from other departments discovered the entertainment value of watching someone so clearly out of place try to navigate an environment designed to exclude them. She'd even received direct messages from students at other Ivy League schools, sharing similar stories and asking for updates on Project Reality Check, her private name for the systematic campaign to show Alex Chen exactly where she belonged. Alex walked into Morrison Hall to find her usual corner seat occupied by a carefully arranged display. Someone had placed a small potted plant on her desk with a note, "For your future office at the unemployment line." Next to it sat a pamphlet for community colleges in the area and a printed email, clearly fake but convincingly formatted, supposedly from the university's financial aid office, asking about her scholarship compliance status. The setup was photographed from multiple angles before Alex even entered the room. Students had positioned themselves strategically to capture her reaction, their phones ready to document whatever emotional breakdown they expected to finally provoke. Alex surveyed the display without expression, then carefully moved everything to an empty chair nearby and sat down. She opened her notebook and began reviewing her notes for the day's lesson, as if nothing had happened. Around her, the disappointed murmurs of students who'd expected tears or anger created a low buzz of frustration.
Professor Mitchell entered with his usual theatrical flair, but today he carried himself with the particular satisfaction of someone who believed he was about to witness a valuable teaching moment. The university's administration had been fielding calls from concerned parents about diversity standards and academic rigor. Calls that, coincidentally, seemed to center around one particular student who clearly didn't meet the institution's unofficial requirements. Today we'll discuss the importance of organizational fit, Mitchell announced, clicking to his first slide. The image showed a perfectly diverse corporate team posed around a conference table, all wearing identical expressions of manufactured confidence. Successful organizations require cultural cohesion. When team members don't share common values, backgrounds, or standards, the entire structure suffers. His gaze found Alex immediately. It's not enough to simply occupy a space. One must belong in it. And belonging requires more than just showing up. Jessica raised her hand with the practiced ease of someone who'd been dominating classroom discussions since kindergarten. Professor Mitchell, what happens when someone refuses to adapt to organizational culture, when they insist on maintaining behaviors or presentations that work against team cohesion? Mitchell's smile was sharp and approving. Excellent question, Miss Hamilton. In the corporate world, such individuals are typically counseled out. It's actually a kindness, allowing someone to continue in an environment where they clearly don't fit, only prolongs their inevitable failure. Brandon leaned back in his chair, his designer messenger bag prominently displayed. But don't some people just refuse to see reality? Like they think they belong somewhere when everyone else can see they obviously don't? Unfortunately, yes, some individuals lack the self-awareness to recognize when they're out of their depth. It falls to natural leaders, his eyes swept across Jessica, Brandon, and Riley, to provide guidance, even when that guidance isn't initially welcome. The lecture continued with increasingly pointed examples. Mitchell discussed professional presentation standards while showing slides of properly dressed executives. He emphasized cultural capital and institutional knowledge while explaining how certain backgrounds simply prepared people better for leadership roles. Every concept seemed designed to reinforce a single message. Some people belonged, and others didn't. During the break, the exclusion became more systematic and deliberate. Riley approached Alex's seat with her phone held casually at her side, the camera recording everything. Riley, honey, we need to talk about our project. Jessica, Brandon, and I met last night to discuss strategy, and we're a little concerned. Concerned about what? Alex asked, not looking up from her notes. Well, Jessica said, sliding into the seat next to Alex with the predatory grace of someone moving in for a kill, we did some research on military leadership principles, and it's incredibly complex, much more technical than we initially thought. Brandon nodded seriously. The sources we found require serious academic credentials to access: military databases, classified analysis reports, interviews with actual commanders. It's graduate-level stuff. Maybe even postgraduate, Riley added helpfully. My mother's contacts at the Pentagon said you really need security clearance just to understand the terminology properly. Alex's pen stopped moving across her notebook page. Security clearance?
Exactly. Jessica's voice carried the triumph of someone who believed they'd finally found the perfect trap. You need actual military connections, real relationships with people who've been in command positions. It's not something you can just research online. So, we've restructured the project, Brandon announced, pulling out a printed outline that had clearly been prepared in advance. Jessica will handle corporate crisis management. She's got real boardroom experience. I'll cover media relations during crises. My family's company has dealt with several PR emergencies. Riley will handle government and diplomatic crisis response. Her mother's State Department background gives her unique insight. They all looked at Alex expectantly. And you, Jessica said with false sweetness, can handle the PowerPoint design and formatting. Very important support work, really crucial to the overall presentation. The relegation was complete and carefully documented. Around them, other students pretended to work on their own projects while actually watching the systematic exclusion play out like a masterclass in social dominance. Actually, Alex said quietly, I think I can manage the military section. Riley laughed, the sound sharp and condescending. Alex, we're trying to help you here. Military leadership isn't like civilian management. These are people who've commanded troops in combat, made life and death decisions under fire, coordinated complex operations across multiple theaters. She trailed off, not noticing the way Alex's grip tightened almost imperceptibly on her pen. It requires a kind of authority and experience that you just can't fake. Real commanders have this presence, this immediate credibility. People follow them because they know these leaders have earned the right to give orders. Jessica leaned closer, her voice taking on the tone of someone explaining something to a particularly slow child. Look, we all have our strengths. Yours just happen to be more supportive, administrative. There's no shame in that. Alex closed her notebook and looked at each of them in turn. For a moment, something flickered behind her eyes, a kind of assessment, as if she were calculating distances and angles, threats and responses. But when she spoke, her voice was calm and even. I understand your concerns, but I'd like to try the military section. The response frustrated them because it wasn't the breakdown they'd orchestrated so carefully. Jessica's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. Riley's phone captured the moment from the perfect angle. Brandon's smirk faltered slightly as he tried to process Alex's persistent calm. Fine, Jessica said finally, her voice sharp with barely contained irritation. But when you realized you're in over your head, don't expect us to bail you out. Our grades are on the line here. As Alex packed up her things, she had no way of knowing that in exactly 24 hours, her quiet persistence would be validated in the most dramatic way possible. The military section they'd mocked her for claiming, she'd lived it. The combat leadership they said she couldn't understand, she'd commanded it. And when those Black Hawk helicopters landed on Riverside University's perfectly manicured lawn, every assumption they'd made about the quiet girl in the corner would shatter like glass.
Friday morning arrived with the kind of electric anticipation that precedes a storm. The campus buzzed with an energy that had nothing to do with academics and everything to do with the carefully orchestrated spectacle that Jessica Hamilton had planned for crisis management class. Over the past 3 days, what had started as casual mockery had evolved into something far more systematic and cruel, a public performance designed to definitively establish social hierarchies and put certain people firmly in their place. Alex Chen walked across campus unaware that her every step was being broadcast live on Instagram stories to an audience that now included students from 3 other universities. The hashtag thrift store girl phenomenon had spread beyond Riverside, becoming a cautionary tale about knowing one's limits and understanding where one truly belonged. Educational influencers were using her as a case study in imposter syndrome. Business school podcasts discussed her situation as an example of cultural mismatch in elite environments. She entered Morrison Hall to find something that made her pause for the first time all week. Her usual corner had been completely transformed. Someone had created what they called an inspiration station, a collection of motivational posters about knowing your worth, finding your path, and embracing your authentic self. A small banner hung from the desk reading, Future Community College Success Story, complete with balloons and a gift basket filled with items from the dollar store. But that wasn't the most elaborate part of the setup. Jessica had convinced Professor Mitchell to allow peer presentation practice before the final presentations next week. Each group would give a preliminary presentation today, with feedback from classmates. Of course, Alex's group would go last, ensuring maximum audience for what Jessica privately called the grand finale. The gift basket included a handwritten note in Jessica's perfect cursive. For when you find your real calling, we believe in you. XOXO, your crisis management classmates.
The note was signed by dozens of students, including several Alex had never even spoken to. Students filled the lecture hall with unusual enthusiasm, phones and cameras positioned strategically. Someone had even brought a professional-grade video camera, claiming it was for a documentary project about different learning styles. The atmosphere was electric with anticipation, like a crowd gathering for a gladiator fight. Alex examined the display with the same calm expression she'd maintained all week, then quietly moved everything to an empty chair and sat down. Around her, the disappointed murmurs of students who'd expected a bigger reaction created a familiar soundtrack of frustration. Professor Mitchell entered with barely contained excitement. Today's class would be interactive and student-driven, he announced, a chance for future leaders to practice giving and receiving feedback in high-pressure situations. Remember, he said, clicking to his first slide, leadership is ultimately about performance under pressure. Today, you'll demonstrate not just your knowledge, but your ability to maintain composure when all eyes are on you. The first three groups gave standard presentations about crisis management in various industries, polished PowerPoints, rehearsed talking points, safe corporate examples. The audience was polite but distracted, clearly waiting for the main event. Finally, Mitchell called Alex's group to the front. Jessica, Brandon, and Riley moved to the presentation area with practiced confidence. Alex followed, carrying only her simple notebook. No slides, no graphics, no multimedia presentation, just notes written in her neat, economical handwriting. Our topic is military leadership principles in corporate crisis management, Jessica announced, her voice carrying easily through the room's sound system. I'll be discussing boardroom crisis management, drawing from my father's experience with Hamilton and Associates during the 2019 market volatility. She launched into a polished presentation about corporate decision-making under pressure, complete with charts and graphs and buzzwords that sounded impressive to people who'd never actually made decisions that mattered. The audience nodded appreciatively. Brandon followed with a slick presentation about media relations during corporate crises, peppered with examples from his family's media empire and internship experiences that had taught him how to manage public perception when profits were at stake. Riley's section covered diplomatic crisis management, sharing insights from her mother's State Department career and discussing how government agencies coordinate responses to international incidents. All three presentations were smooth, professional, and completely surface level, the kind of analysis you could get from reading Harvard Business Review articles and watching CNN. Then it was Alex's turn. She walked to the front of the room carrying only her notebook, no slides, no graphics, no multimedia presentation. Just a quiet woman in thrift store clothes facing a room of people who'd spent 3 days proving she didn't belong there. I'll be covering military leadership principles, she said simply. The room fell silent with anticipation. Phones focused on her face, ready to capture the moment when she'd finally be exposed as completely out of her depth. Jessica's smile was sharp with triumph. Brandon leaned back in his chair with barely concealed glee. Riley had her camera positioned for the perfect angle.
Military leadership, Alex began, her voice steady and clear, is fundamentally different from corporate or civilian leadership because the consequences of failure aren't measured in profits or market share. They're measured in lives. Something in her tone made a few students sit up straighter. There was a quality to her voice, an authority that hadn't been there in casual conversation. When you're commanding a unit in hostile territory, you don't have the luxury of committee decisions or focus groups. You have seconds to assess choices that will determine whether your people come home alive. She opened her notebook, but Alex didn't read from it. Instead, she spoke with the kind of detailed precision that only comes from personal experience. Take, for example, the principle of leading from the front. In combat situations, this isn't metaphorical. It means literally placing yourself in the most dangerous position to demonstrate that you won't ask your people to face risks you're not willing to take yourself. A few students exchanged glances. This wasn't the stumbling, unprepared presentation they'd expected. Or consider decision-making under fire.
When your convoy is ambushed and you have wounded personnel, burning vehicles, and enemy contact from multiple directions, you don't have time for stakeholder analysis. You assess, you decide, you act, and you accept full responsibility for the consequences. The room was completely silent now. Even Professor Mitchell had stopped pretending to grade papers and was listening intently. Military leaders understand that authority isn't given. It's earned through competence, courage, and the willingness to sacrifice for your mission and your people. Soldiers don't follow you because of your rank or your background or your family connections. They follow you because they trust that you know what you're doing and that you'll bring them home. Alex paused, looking around the room. For the first time all week, she had everyone's complete attention. The most important lesson from military leadership is this: when everything falls apart, when all your careful plans collapse, and people are counting on you to save them, leadership isn't about having the right credentials or the perfect presentation. It's about stepping forward when everyone else steps back. She closed her notebook. Questions? The silence stretched for what felt like an eternity. Then slowly, hands began to rise throughout the room. Not mockingly, not dismissively, but with genuine curiosity about the insights she just shared. For the first time all week, Jessica Hamilton's confident smile faltered completely. And in exactly 18 hours, Black Hawk helicopters would land on their campus with a message that would prove every word Alex just spoke came from a place of hard-earned truth. Saturday morning shattered the peaceful quiet of Riverside University at exactly 6:47 a.m. with an alarm that most students had never heard before. The emergency broadcast system, installed after 9/11 but never used for anything more serious than severe weather warnings, screamed across campus with a message that sent administrative staff into immediate panic mode. Attention, all campus personnel. This is not a drill. Chemical leak detected in the Riverside Township Industrial District. Winds carrying potential contamination toward campus. All students and staff report immediately to designated emergency shelters. Repeat, this is not a drill. Alex Chen was already awake, sitting by her dorm room window with a cup of coffee and her crisis management textbook. Military habits died hard, and she'd been up since 0500 hours, a schedule that had earned her strange looks from her roommate, who considered anything before noon to be cruel and unusual punishment. The sound of the emergency alarm triggered responses that had been drilled into her bones long before she'd ever heard of Riverside University. Within minutes, chaos erupted across campus. Students stumbled out of dormitories in various states of dress and consciousness, most of them treating the situation like an inconvenient fire drill. RAs shouted contradictory instructions while consulting emergency protocols they'd skimmed once during orientation. Campus security guards, most of whom were retired mall cops with minimal crisis training, struggled to establish any semblance of order. The designated emergency shelter was the university's main gymnasium, a cavernous space that could theoretically hold the entire campus population, but had never been tested under actual emergency conditions. As hundreds of confused, scared, and increasingly angry students poured into the building, it became immediately clear that theoretical capacity and practical management were two very different things. Professor Mitchell arrived looking harried and unprepared, his usually perfect hair disheveled and his designer polo shirt wrinkled from sleeping. He'd been designated as one of the emergency coordinators by virtue of teaching crisis management, but there was a significant difference between lecturing about emergency protocols and actually implementing them under pressure. "Everyone needs to remain calm," he announced through a bullhorn, his voice betraying the very panic he was asking others to avoid. "We have procedures for this situation. Emergency management is about following established protocols." But the established protocols were failing spectacularly. The shelter's communication system crackled with static and conflicting reports.
Local emergency services were overwhelmed with calls from across the township. Cell towers were overloaded as thousands of people tried to contact family members simultaneously. The university's emergency supply cache, theoretically stocked with enough food, water, and medical supplies for 48 hours, was scattered across multiple locked storage rooms, and half the keys were missing. Jessica Hamilton stood near the gymnasium's main entrance with her usual entourage, but for the first time all week, her perfect composure was cracking. Her designer athleisure outfit looked incongruous in the industrial setting of the emergency shelter, and her usual confidence was replaced by barely controlled anxiety. "This is ridiculous," she announced to anyone within earshot. "My father's company has dealt with actual crises. This is completely disorganized. Someone needs to take charge." Brandon Torres noted agreement while frantically trying to get cell service. "My family's security team could handle this better. Where's the leadership? Where's the command structure?" Riley Matthews was live streaming the chaos to her social media followers, providing running commentary about the complete failure of institutional crisis management. Her battery was already at 30%, and the portable chargers she'd brought to campus were buried somewhere in her dorm room. As the morning progressed, the situation deteriorated rapidly. What had started as confusion evolved into something approaching panic. Students with medical conditions couldn't access their medications. International students couldn't reach their families. The cafeteria staff, who'd been evacuated along with everyone else, couldn't access food preparation areas to provide food for hundreds of hungry, scared people. Professor Mitchell stood at the center of the gymnasium floor, surrounded by increasingly frustrated students and staff, consulting an emergency management manual that seemed to assume resources and coordination that simply didn't exist in reality. "According to protocol," he read from the manual, "we should have established communication with local emergency management within the first hour. We should have a clear chain of command, designated roles for all personnel, and regular updates from authorities." "But we don't have any of that," pointed out Dr. Elena Rodriguez, a chemistry professor who'd volunteered to help coordinate the response. "The communication systems are down, half the emergency personnel are missing, and no one seems to know what's actually happening with this chemical leak." Around them, the noise level was rising as hundreds of conversations competed with crying children, barking dogs that people had brought from off-campus housing, and the constant static of failing communication equipment. "Someone needs to organize this," Jessica announced, her voice carrying the authority she'd inherited from boardroom genetics. She walked to where Professor Mitchell stood with his manual. "We need teams, coordination, clear assignments."
But when she tried to take charge, the result was more chaos rather than less. Students who didn't know her personally saw no reason to follow orders from another panicked peer. Her suggestions, while theoretically sound, were based on corporate crisis management principles that didn't translate well to mass evacuation scenarios. Meanwhile, Alex Chen sat quietly in a corner of the gymnasium, observing everything with the kind of systematic attention that had once kept her alive in much more dangerous situations. She watched the failed communication attempts, noted the lack of supply chain coordination, cataloged the various groups forming and dissolving as people searched for leadership they could trust. She saw exactly what needed to be done, and also saw that no one was doing it. The chemical leak was real, but it wasn't immediately life-threatening if handled properly. The greater danger was the panic and disorganization that could lead to stampedes, medical emergencies, or complete breakdown of order. What the situation needed wasn't more committees or discussions about protocol. It needed someone who could assess rapidly, decide quickly, and act decisively. It needed military leadership. But Alex remained in her corner, watching, waiting. She'd left that life behind for good reasons. She'd hung up her uniform and walked away from command decisions because the weight of responsibility had nearly destroyed her. The last time she'd been in charge of people's safety,
not everyone had come home. Around her, the chaos continued to build. Professor Mitchell's voice grew strained with each failed attempt to establish order. Jessica's corporate-style leadership directives were meeting with increasing resistance. The situation was spiraling towards something that could become genuinely dangerous. And in less than 12 hours, military helicopters would land on the campus quad with a message that would change everything Alex thought she knew about leaving the past behind. But first, she would have to decide whether to watch her fellow students flounder in a crisis she knew exactly how to solve, or step forward one more time into the kind of leadership role she'd sworn she'd never take again.
At 11:23 a.m., the situation in the gymnasium reached its breaking point. A sophomore with severe asthma began having an attack, his inhaler locked away in his dorm room 3 buildings away. The university's medical staff consisted of 2 nurses who'd been trained for routine health center visits, not mass casualty events. The campus security guards had no medical training beyond basic first aid, and the local paramedics were overwhelmed with calls from across the township. Professor Mitchell stood frozen with his emergency manual, reading protocols for medical emergencies that required resources they didn't have. Jessica Hamilton was on her phone trying to reach her father's corporate crisis team, shouting over the noise about liability and proper procedures. The student was turning blue. That's when Alex Chen stood up. She didn't announce herself. She didn't ask permission. She simply walked across the gymnasium floor with the kind of purposeful stride that made people instinctively step aside. By the time she reached the student, she was already assessing his condition with the clinical precision of someone who triaged wounded soldiers under enemy fire. "What's his name?" she asked the girl kneeling beside him. "Tyler," the girl sobbed. "Tyler Morrison. He forgot his rescue inhaler. He can't breathe." Alex knelt beside Tyler, her hands steady as she checked his pulse and breathing pattern. "Tyler, I need you to look at me. Focus on my voice. We're going to get through this together." Her tone was calm, authoritative, completely in control. Around them, the crowd had gone quiet, drawn by something they couldn't quite name, a presence that commanded attention without demanding it. "I need someone to find Professor Rodriguez. She's the chemistry professor. She'll have an emergency inhaler in her bag. Professors with science backgrounds always carry medical supplies." A dozen students immediately scattered to find Dr. Rodriguez. "I need the 2 largest male students here to clear a path to the main doors. If we need to get Tyler to emergency services, that route needs to be completely clear." Brandon Torres and his roommate found themselves moving without question, their earlier skepticism forgotten in the face of someone who clearly knew what she was doing. "And I need someone to call emergency services and give them Tyler's exact symptoms, his approximate age and weight, and tell them we may need immediate transport," Alex said to Riley, who was already dialing, before she realized she was following orders from the girl she'd spent 3 days mocking. Within minutes, Dr. Rodriguez appeared with an emergency inhaler. Tyler's breathing stabilized. The crowd's panic subsided into something manageable. But more importantly, something fundamental had shifted in the gymnasium's power structure. Professor Mitchell approached with his emergency manual still clutched in his hands. "Miss Chen, that was... How did you know to..." "Emergency medical response," Alex replied simply, helping Tyler to his feet. "It's about rapid assessment and resource allocation under pressure." Around them, students were looking at Alex differently now. The quiet girl in thrift store clothes had just demonstrated the kind of competence under pressure that all their theoretical training was supposed to provide. But Tyler's medical emergency was just the beginning. The chemical leak situation was worsening. Reports coming through the failing communication system indicated that the contamination plume was larger than initially estimated and shifting with changing wind patterns. What had been projected as a 6-hour shelter-in-place situation was now looking like at least 24 hours. The gymnasium's emergency supplies were inadequate for extended occupancy. The water reserves were running low. The portable toilets were failing. The heating system wasn't designed for this many people. Tensions were rising as students realized this wasn't going to be over quickly. Professor Mitchell gathered the designated emergency coordinators, faculty members who'd volunteered for crisis management roles but had no practical experience. Their discussion was circular and ineffective, focused more on following proper protocols than solving immediate problems. "We need to establish a proper command structure,"
Mitchell insisted. "According to the manual, we should have designated teams for communications, logistics, medical support, and crowd management." "But who's going to lead those teams?" asked Dr. Rodriguez. "And with what resources? Half our communication equipment doesn't work, our logistics are a mess, and we have 2 nurses for 800 people." As the official emergency coordinators argued about procedures, Alex was quietly organizing actual solutions. She'd identified several students with relevant skills: a pre-med student who could assist with medical issues, an engineering student who understood the building systems, a business major who'd worked in supply chain management. Without fanfare or formal appointments, she began coordinating their efforts. "Sarah," she said to the pre-med student, "we need to do a medical census. Find out who has chronic conditions, who's taking medication, who might need special attention if we're here overnight." "Marcus," she told the engineering student, "check the building's ventilation system. If we're dealing with airborne contamination, we need to know how well this space is sealed and whether we can improve air filtration." "Jennifer," she said to the business major, "inventory our actual supplies, not what the manual says we should have, but what we actually have available: food, water, basic necessities." Each student moved immediately to their assigned tasks, responding to something in Alex's manner that inspired confidence rather than resistance.
Jessica Hamilton watched this coordination with growing unease. The social hierarchy she'd worked so hard to establish was crumbling as students naturally gravitated towards someone who clearly knew how to handle crisis situations. "Who put her in charge?" Jessica asked Professor Mitchell. "We have established emergency protocols. She's not even faculty." Mitchell looked around the gymnasium, noting how much calmer and more organized things had become since Alex had started coordinating activities. "She seems to know what she's doing." "But she's just a student," Brandon protested. "She doesn't have the authority to give orders." "Authority," Alex said quietly, having overheard the conversation, "isn't something you're given. It's something you earn." Her words carried across the gymnasium with unusual clarity, and suddenly, everyone was listening. "In a real crisis, people don't follow you because of your title or your background or your family connections," she continued, echoing the presentation she'd given just the day before. "They follow you because they trust that you can keep them safe." Around the gymnasium, hundreds of students nodded in unconscious agreement. Over the past several hours, they'd watched their designated leaders flounder, while the quiet girl they'd dismissed had stepped forward to provide the competence and calm they desperately needed. For the first time in 4 years, Alex Chen felt the familiar weight of command settling on her shoulders, and despite everything she'd promised herself about leaving that life behind, she found herself accepting it. Because in 8 hours, when military helicopters landed on their campus, she would need every ounce of the leadership skills she'd tried so hard to forget. By 3 p.m., the transformation in the gymnasium was impossible to ignore. What had been chaos 6 hours earlier had evolved into something approaching military efficiency, though most of the students couldn't quite identify why everything suddenly felt so organized and purposeful. Alex had divided the massive space into functional zones without anyone really noticing the transition. The main floor now had designated areas for medical triage, communications, supply distribution, and rest areas. Students moved between zones with clear purposes rather than wandering aimlessly. The noise level had dropped from panicked shouting to purposeful conversation. Dr. Rodriguez found herself serving as Alex's unofficial second-in-command, a role she'd accepted without quite understanding how it had happened. "This is remarkable," she murmured to Alex as they reviewed the medical census Sarah had completed. 6 hours ago, we were in complete disarray. Now we have accountability for every person in this building, medical status reports, supply inventories, and functional communication with emergency services." Alex nodded, studying the handwritten charts that tracked everything from diabetic students who needed regular meals to international students who were struggling with language barriers during the crisis. "It's about systems," she said simply. "Every person needs to know their role and understand how it fits into the larger mission." "Mission?" Dr. Rodriguez raised an eyebrow. That's interesting terminology for an emergency shelter situation. For just a moment, Alex's carefully maintained civilian persona slipped. Operation, she corrected quickly. Emergency operation. But Dr. Rodriguez had caught the slip, and she wasn't the only one starting to notice things that didn't quite add up. Marcus Kim, the engineering student Alex had tasked with building systems analysis, approached with a detailed report about the gymnasium's capacity, ventilation, and structural integrity. His presentation was thorough and professional, but his expression was puzzled. "Alex, can I ask you something?" he said after delivering his briefing. "How did you know to ask me about the HVAC system's filtration capacity? That's pretty specific technical knowledge for a crisis management student." Alex looked up from the communication log she was reviewing. It seemed relevant given the airborne contamination concerns. "Yeah, but you asked specifically about the building's positive pressure capabilities and whether we could isolate the ventilation system from external air intake. That's the kind of question you'd expect from someone with experience in chemical warfare defense or hazmat operations." Around them, other students were beginning to listen to the conversation. Alex's methodical approach to crisis management had impressed everyone. But as the immediate panic subsided, people were starting to notice details that raised questions. Jennifer Washington, the business major handling supply logistics, joined the group with her own observations. "Alex, your inventory system is incredibly sophisticated. You've set up supply chain tracking that accounts for consumption rates, priority allocation, and reserve management. This isn't basic emergency management. This is military-grade logistics coordination." Jessica Hamilton, who'd been growing increasingly frustrated as her own authority was completely ignored, seized on the conversation. "That's what I've been wondering," she announced loud enough to draw attention from across the gymnasium. "How does a graduate student know so much about emergency command structures?" Her voice carried the sharp edge of someone who'd spent 3 days being systematically humiliated and was looking for any opportunity to regain some social ground. Students throughout the area turned to listen, sensing potential drama. "I mean, the way you organize response teams, establish communication protocols, coordinated medical triage, it's like you've done this before." Jessica continued, her tone growing more pointed. "Where exactly did you learn all this?" Brandon Torres, still smarting from having been essentially demoted from social leader to supply carrier, joined the interrogation. "Yeah, and the way you handled Tyler's medical emergency, you knew exactly what to do, exactly what to ask for. That wasn't basic first aid, that was field medic level response." Riley Matthews pulled out her phone, sensing content opportunity. "This is actually a good question. Alex, what's your background? Because you're managing this crisis better than our actual emergency coordinators." Professor Mitchell, who'd been relegated to consulting his manual while Alex made actual decisions, looked up with renewed interest. The question of his own diminished authority in the situation was becoming impossible to ignore. "Ms. Chen, your performance today has been exceptional, but I have to ask, do you have previous crisis management experience, professional training, perhaps?" Alex stood quietly in the center of the growing circle, aware that every word she said would be recorded, analyzed, and probably broadcast to social media within minutes. The careful anonymity she'd maintained for 4 years was cracking under the pressure of competence she couldn't hide. "I've had some training," she said carefully. "What kind of training?" Jessica pressed, sensing blood in the water. "Corporate, government, academic?" "Various types," Alex replied, her tone remaining neutral despite the growing pressure. Riley stepped closer with her phone camera focused on Alex's face. "Come on, you can't be this vague. You've been running this emergency response like a professional. People are following your orders without question. That doesn't happen unless you have serious credentials."
Around them, more students were gathering, drawn by the confrontation. The same people who'd been grateful for Alex's leadership were now curious about the mystery surrounding their impromptu commander. Sarah, the pre-med student who'd been helping with medical coordination, joined the questioning with genuine curiosity rather than hostility. Alex, some of the medical protocols you suggested, the triage priorities, the symptom documentation, the casualty tracking, they're more advanced than what we learned in our emergency response training. It's like military medical corps procedures. Military? Brandon latched onto the word immediately. Are you saying she has military training? The word hung in the air like an electric charge. Students throughout the gymnasium turned to look at the quiet girl in thrift store clothes who'd somehow taken command of their emergency response with casual, professional competence. Professor Mitchell stepped forward, his academic curiosity overriding his bruised ego. Miss Chen, if you have military experience, that would explain a great deal about your performance today. What was your branch of service? Alex looked around the circle of faces, some curious, some suspicious, some still grateful for her leadership but now confused about who she really was. After 4 years of careful anonymity, her past was surfacing whether she wanted it to or not. I served, she said quietly. In what capacity? Jessica demanded, her tone sharp with the kind of aggressive interrogation she'd learned in prep school debate classes. For just a moment, Alex's carefully maintained composure shifted. Something flickered in her eyes, a recognition of the corner she'd been backed into, and a decision about how to respond. I was an officer, she said simply. The admission sent ripples of whispers throughout the gathered crowd. An officer? That explained the command presence, the systematic approach, the way people instinctively followed her directions. But it also raised new questions. What kind of officer? What rank? What unit? And most importantly, why was a former military officer enrolled as a graduate student at Riverside University, dressed in thrift store clothes, and sitting quietly in the back of crisis management class? In 5 hours, those questions would be answered in the most dramatic way possible. But for now, Alex Chen stood in the center of a gymnasium full of people she'd kept safe, facing questions about a past she'd hoped to leave buried. The truth was coming whether she was ready or not.
At exactly 8:17 p.m., the rhythmic thump of rotor blades cut through the evening air above Riverside University's campus. The sound was unmistakable to anyone who'd served in the military. The deep, powerful beat of Black Hawk helicopters approaching at tactical speed. Most of the students in the gymnasium had never heard anything like it outside of movies. Alex Chen froze in the middle of reviewing supply distribution reports. Every muscle in her body went rigid as the familiar sound triggered responses that had been drilled into her bones through years of combat deployments. Her hand instinctively moved toward her hip, where a sidearm should have been, before she caught herself and forced her civilian posture back into place. But the helicopters were getting closer, and that sound meant only one thing. The military was coming to Riverside University. "What is that?" Riley Matthews asked, her phone already recording as she moved toward the gymnasium's windows. The sound of the rotors was growing louder, more intense, impossible to ignore. Students throughout the building began gravitating toward the windows and doors, craning their necks to see what was approaching their campus. The noise was overwhelming now, not just one helicopter, but at least 2, possibly 3, coming in fast and low. Professor Mitchell consulted his emergency manual frantically. "This isn't in the protocols," he muttered. "Military response isn't supposed to be involved unless there's a national security component." Through the gymnasium's tall windows, the first Black Hawk came into view, sleek and powerful against the darkening sky. It was followed immediately by a second, both aircraft flying in perfect formation as they approached the campus quad. Jessica Hamilton pressed against the window, her designer emergency outfit forgotten as she stared at the approaching helicopters. Are those military? Why would the military be coming here?" The aircraft circled the campus once in a pattern that anyone with tactical training would recognize as a security sweep, then began their descent toward the main quad. The rotor wash from their landing approach sent leaves and debris swirling across the perfectly manicured lawn, while students throughout the campus came pouring out of buildings to witness the unprecedented arrival. Alex stood frozen in the center of the gymnasium, watching through the windows as the helicopters touched down with precision that spoke of countless combat landings. This wasn't happening. This couldn't be happening.
She'd left that world behind. She'd buried Captain Alexandra Chen so deep that no one should have been able to find her. But as the rotors wound down and the aircraft settled onto the quad, Alex could see figures emerging from the helicopters. Military figures in full dress uniform, not the casual fatigues of a routine assistance mission. This was official. This was formal. This was the kind of arrival that meant someone very important had come looking for someone very specific. "Oh my God," Sarah whispered, pointing through the window at the side of the nearest helicopter. "Look at the markings!" Painted on the side of the lead Black Hawk, clearly visible even from the gymnasium, was a name in bold military lettering: Phoenix. The gymnasium fell silent as students processed what they were seeing. Phoenix, the call sign painted on the side of a military helicopter that had just landed on their campus during an emergency that Alex Chen had managed with the kind of professional competence that had raised questions all day. Jessica Hamilton turned slowly from the window to stare at Alex, her face pale with dawning realization. Phoenix. That's not a coincidence, is it? Around the gymnasium, hundreds of students were connecting dots that painted a picture none of them had imagined possible. The quiet girl in thrift store clothes, the one they'd mocked and dismissed and systematically excluded, was somehow connected to military helicopters that bore her call sign. Alex felt the walls of her carefully constructed civilian identity collapsing around her. 4 years of anonymity, of blending into the background, of being nobody special, all of it crumbling in the space of a few minutes as her past quite literally landed on her doorstep. Through the gymnasium's main entrance, she could see a figure in full-dress military uniform walking across the campus quad, flanked by 2 other officers. Even at this distance, even after 4 years, Alex recognized the stride, the bearing, the unmistakable presence of General Sarah Washington. General Washington had been Alex's commanding officer during her final deployment, the woman who'd signed her commendation and accepted her resignation, the only person in the military who knew exactly why Captain Alexandra Chen walked away from a distinguished career at the age of 26. And now she was here, on a college campus, in full dress uniform, looking for the woman who'd once been her most trusted field commander. "Alex," Dr. Rodriguez said quietly, approaching from behind, "I think you need to tell us who you really are." The gymnasium had gone completely silent except for the distant sound of helicopter engines cooling down. Hundreds of students stared at Alex, waiting for explanations that would make sense of what they had just witnessed. Brandon Torres pulled out his phone and began frantically searching military databases. "Phoenix," he muttered, typing rapidly. "Military call sign Phoenix. There's got to be records, service information." His face went white as search results populated his screen. "Oh my God," he whispered. "Captain Alexandra Chen, call sign Phoenix, Distinguished Service Cross, Bronze Star with V device, multiple combat deployments, Special Operations Aviation Regiment."
He looked up from his phone, his expression a mixture of shock and something approaching awe. "Alex, you're not just a veteran. You're a decorated combat pilot. You commanded special operations missions?" Riley's phone was recording everything, capturing the moment when months of social media mockery collided with a reality none of them had imagined. The hashtag #ThriftStoreGirl hashtag was about to take on a very different meaning. Jessica Hamilton sank into a nearby chair, her face pale with the realization of exactly who she'd been targeting with her systematic campaign of humiliation. We had no idea," she whispered. Professor Mitchell approached with his emergency manual hanging forgotten at his side. "Miss Chen, Captain Chen, why didn't you tell us? Why didn't you identify yourself when the crisis began?" Alex looked around the gymnasium at the faces of people she'd kept safe, people who'd spent days questioning her right to be there, people who were now learning that she'd walked away from a military career most of them couldn't even comprehend. "Because," she said quietly, "I came here to be nobody. I came here to forget." Outside, General Washington was approaching the gymnasium entrance, her dress uniform immaculate, her expression unreadable. In her hand, she carried a sealed envelope that would answer all the questions about why military helicopters had landed on a college campus to find a woman who'd been trying very hard to disappear. The confrontation Alex had been avoiding for 4 years was about to happen in front of 800 witnesses, broadcast live on social media, and recorded for posterity. The past had finally caught up to Captain Alexandra Chen, callsign Phoenix, whether she was ready or not.
General Sarah Washington entered the gymnasium with the kind of commanding presence that made 800 people fall silent without her saying a word. At 54, she carried herself with the bearing of someone who'd spent 3 decades making decisions that shaped global military operations. Her dress uniform was immaculate, her silver stars catching the gymnasium's fluorescent lights, her expression unreadable as she surveyed the crowd of students and faculty. But her eyes found Alex immediately, and for just a moment, her composed military facade cracked to reveal something that looked almost like relief. "Captain Chen," she said, her voice carrying easily across the silent gymnasium. "It's good to see you." The formal military address hit the assembled crowd like a physical blow. Captain Chen. Not Alex. Not student. Captain Chen, spoken by a general who'd traveled hundreds of miles and deployed military aircraft to find her. Alex stood slowly, and for the first time since arriving at Riverside University, her carefully maintained civilian posture straightened into something unmistakably military. Shoulders back, spine straight, chin level. The bearing of an officer trained to command respect in the most dangerous places on Earth. "General Washington," Alex replied, her voice steady despite the chaos of emotions beneath the surface. "This is unexpected." Professor Mitchell stepped forward with his emergency manual, clearly struggling to process the collision between his academic emergency protocols and the reality of a general in his gymnasium. "General, I'm Professor Mitchell, designated emergency coordinator. Is this related to the chemical leak situation? We weren't expecting military involvement." General Washington's gaze didn't leave Alex as she replied. "Professor, the chemical leak was contained 3 hours ago. The contamination risk has been eliminated, and civilian authorities are managing the cleanup. I'm not here about your emergency." Her words rippled through the crowd in whispers and murmurs. The crisis was over? They'd been managing an emergency that had already been resolved? "I'm here," General Washington continued, "because we have a situation that requires Captain Chen's immediate expertise." She reached into her uniform jacket and withdrew a sealed envelope bearing official military seals. 3 hours ago, an American diplomatic convoy was ambushed in hostile territory. We have personnel trapped in a combat zone, and the situation is deteriorating rapidly. Standard rescue protocols have failed. The gymnasium had gone completely silent. Students who'd spent 3 days mocking Alex's thrift store clothes were now learning that military generals flew halfway across the country to request her expertise in life-and-death situations. "Captain Chen," General Washington said formally, "your country needs you." Alex stared at the sealed envelope in the general's hands, and everyone in the gymnasium could see the internal war playing out across her features. This was the moment she'd been running from for 4 years, the call back to a world where her decisions determined whether people lived or died. "General," Alex said quietly, "I resigned my commission. I'm not active military." "Your resignation was accepted," General Washington acknowledged, "but your expertise in high-risk extraction operations remains unmatched. The personnel trapped in that combat zone don't have time for us to train someone else or develop alternative strategies." She held out the envelope. "This contains full details of the situation and a formal request for your assistance as a civilian consultant. The decision is yours, Captain, but I need to know now." Around them, students were frantically searching their phones for more information about Alex's military background. Brandon Torres had found combat photography showing a younger Alex in flight gear standing beside military helicopters. Riley Matthews was discovering news articles about successful rescue operations led by an aviation officer whose name had been redacted for security reasons.
Jessica Hamilton sat in stunned silence, processing the magnitude of her mistake. For 3 days, she'd been systematically humiliating a decorated combat veteran whose military record included missions most people couldn't imagine surviving. Dr. Rodriguez approached Alex quietly. "The way you managed our emergency today," she said. "You weren't just applying theoretical knowledge, were you? You were drawing on real experience. Battlefield medicine, resource management under fire, command decisions when people's lives depend on getting it right." She looked around the gymnasium at the students she'd kept safe and organized. The stakes were lower here, but the principles were the same. Sarah, the pre-med student, stepped forward with tears in her eyes. "When Tyler had his asthma attack, you knew exactly what to do because you've saved people before, in combat." "Many times," Alex confirmed quietly. Professor Mitchell was staring at his emergency manual with something approaching horror. "All day, I've been trying to follow protocols while you actually knew how to manage a crisis because you've done it under enemy fire." Marcus Kim looked up from his phone with an expression of awe. "Alex, according to these military databases, you commanded extraction missions in some of the most dangerous areas on Earth. You saved hundreds of lives." The weight of revelation was settling over the entire gymnasium. The quiet girl they dismissed had been one of the military's most elite helicopter pilots, trained in special operations, decorated for valor under fire, trusted with missions that required split-second decisions and absolute competence.
General Washington stepped closer to Alex, her voice dropping to a more personal tone. "Captain, I know why you left. I know what happened on that final mission, and I know the guilt you've been carrying. But the team trapped in that combat zone, they're facing the same kind of situation where your expertise made the difference between mission success and catastrophic loss." Alex's hands trembled slightly as she stared at the sealed envelope. "General, the last time I was in command, not everyone came home." "No," General Washington agreed, "but 97% of them did. Without your leadership, that number would have been 0. The gymnasium was silent, except for the distant hum of the helicopter engines outside. 800 people watched as Alex Chen faced the choice between the anonymous civilian life she'd built and the military calling she'd tried to leave behind. "The personnel in that combat zone," Alex said quietly. "Do we know their status?" "Alive but trapped. Standard extraction protocols have failed due to terrain and enemy positioning. They need someone who can improvise under pressure, someone who understands both aviation operations and ground tactical coordination." General Washington held out the envelope again. "They need Phoenix." Alex looked around the gymnasium one more time, at the students she'd organized and protected, at the faculty who'd underestimated her, at the social media cameras still recording every moment of her decision. Then she took the envelope.
The moment Alex's fingers closed around the sealed envelope, something fundamental shifted in the gymnasium's atmosphere. The quiet graduate student in thrift store clothes was gone, replaced by Captain Alexandra Chen, callsign Phoenix, one of the military's most decorated special operations pilots. Her posture straightened, her gaze sharpened, and her voice carried the unmistakable authority of someone trained to command in the world's most dangerous places. "General, I'll need complete tactical briefings, current intelligence on enemy positions, terrain analysis, and weather reports for the operational area," Alex said, her tone crisp and professional. "How much time do we have before the situation becomes critical?" 6 hours before their position becomes completely untenable, General Washington replied. "Full briefing materials are aboard the aircraft, along with your flight gear." "Flight gear?" Dr. Rodriguez asked, her voice barely above a whisper. General Washington's expression revealed the slightest hint of satisfaction. Captain Chen isn't just consulting on this mission, she's leading it. The trapped personnel specifically requested Phoenix for extraction because she's the only pilot they trust to navigate the terrain and threat environment successfully. The gymnasium erupted in whispers and gasps as the full scope of Alex's military reputation became clear.
She wasn't just a decorated veteran. She was actively being called back to lead a combat mission because no one else had her unique combination of skills and experience. But as Alex prepared to leave with General Washington, the reckoning that had been building for 3 days finally arrived. Jessica Hamilton stood up slowly, her face pale with a mixture of shame and dawning horror at what she'd done. Alex, Captain Chen, She struggled to find words that could encompass the magnitude of her mistake. We had no idea. I never. Alex turned to face her, and for the first time all week, Jessica saw something in those calm eyes that made her take an involuntary step backward. Not anger, not vindictiveness, but a kind of assessment that came from someone who'd evaluated life and death threats in combat zones. You had no idea because you never asked. You saw thrift store clothes and made assumptions about worth. You saw quiet confidence and mistook it for weakness. You created an entire narrative about who I was without ever wondering if you might be wrong. Around the gymnasium, students were frantically deleting social media posts, realizing that their mockery of a decorated combat veteran was now permanently documented online. The hashtag #ThriftStoreGirl had taken on a completely different meaning as news of Alex's identity spread across social platforms. Brandon Torres approached with his phone in his hands, his face flush with embarrassment. Captain Chen, the things we said, the videos we posted, we were making fun of someone who... He trailed off, unable to finish the sentence. Someone who what? Alex asked, her tone neutral, but carrying the weight of someone who'd faced much worse than college social dynamics. Someone who saved lives, Brandon said quietly. Someone who served our country in ways we can't even imagine. Someone who deserved respect instead of ridicule. Riley Matthews had stopped recording, her phone hanging uselessly at her side as she stared at Alex with something approaching awe. You let us mock you for days? You never said anything. You never defended yourself. Because I didn't come here to impress anyone. I came here to learn, to be normal, to put distance between myself and decisions that cost people their lives. But when people needed help, I couldn't stand by and do nothing. Professor Mitchell approached with his emergency manual tucked under his arm, his academic confidence completely shattered. Captain Chen, my conduct this evening was inexcusable. I should have recognized your competence, your leadership. Instead, I allowed personal bias to cloud my judgment. Alex's expression softened slightly. Professor, you followed your training. In crisis situations, people fall back on what they know. The problem is that your training was theoretical, and theory doesn't always translate to reality. She turned to address the entire gymnasium, her voice carrying easily across the silent space. What happened here this week, the assumptions, the judgments, the systematic exclusion, happens everywhere. People see surface appearances and make decisions about worth without looking deeper. But leadership isn't about appearances or credentials or family connections. It's about competence, integrity, and the willingness to step forward when others step back. General Washington checked her watch. Captain, we need to move. Every minute we delay reduces the chances of successful extraction. Alex nodded, but before turning to leave, she had one final message for her classmates. The people who mocked me this week will go on to positions of authority in corporations, government agencies, and military organizations. Remember this moment. Remember that competence doesn't always look the way you expect it to. Remember that the person you dismiss might be exactly the person you need when everything falls apart. She paused at the gymnasium entrance, looking back at the organized emergency shelter she'd created from chaos. And remember that true leaders don't need to announce themselves. They simply step forward when leadership is required. Jessica Hamilton called out as Alex reached the door. Captain Chen, will you forgive us?
Alex stopped, but didn't turn around. There's nothing to forgive.
You treated me exactly the way society taught you to treat someone who looked like they didn't belong. But maybe next time, you'll remember that appearances can be deceiving, and worth isn't measured by clothing or social status. As Alex walked out of the gymnasium toward the waiting helicopters, she left behind a room full of people whose understanding of leadership, competence, and judgment had been fundamentally changed. Students who'd spent 3 days documenting her humiliation were now witnessing her departure to lead a combat mission that would save American lives. The quiet girl in thrift store clothes was gone, replaced by Captain Alexandra Chen, callsign Phoenix, walking toward Black Hawk helicopters with the confident stride of someone trained to succeed in the world's most dangerous places. Behind her, 800 people sat in stunned silence, processing the magnitude of their mistake and the lesson they'd never forget about the danger of judging others by appearances rather than character. In 6 hours, Alex would either return victorious from a successful rescue mission, or she wouldn't return at all. But either way, she'd already accomplished something remarkable. She'd shown an entire campus what real leadership looked like and why competence should never be confused with credentials.
18 hours later, the first news reports began filtering across social media platforms, then television networks, and finally through official military channels. The story was extraordinary, even by special operations standards. A retired combat pilot pulled from civilian life to lead a rescue mission that had stumped the military's best tactical minds, had successfully extracted 5 trapped diplomatic personnel from a hostile zone that conventional wisdom said was impossible to penetrate. Captain Alexandra Chen, callsign Phoenix, had done what 3 previous rescue attempts had failed to accomplish. She'd improvised a night extraction using terrain that other pilots deemed too dangerous, coordinated ground support through hostile territory, and brought everyone home alive. The mission had required exactly the kind of split-second decision-making and tactical improvisation that had made her legendary during her active service. According to preliminary reports, she'd identified a narrow window of opportunity that existed for less than 12 minutes, executed a high-risk maneuver that military aviation instructors would later use as a textbook example of advanced helicopter operations, and coordinated the extraction under enemy fire with the kind of calm precision that saved lives. But at Riverside University, the story resonated on a much more personal level. The gymnasium had been cleared and returned to normal by Sunday morning, but the impact of what had happened there lingered throughout the campus community. Students walked differently, spoke more carefully about assumptions and judgments. Faculty members found themselves questioning their own biases about appearances and credentials. Jessica Hamilton sat in her luxury dorm room, staring at her laptop screen as news coverage of the rescue mission played on repeat. The same woman she'd systematically humiliated for wearing thrift store clothes was being described by military analysts as one of the most skilled combat pilots of her generation, and the only person capable of executing this particular rescue operation. The contrast was devastating. While Jessica had been creating hashtags and orchestrating social media campaigns to mock Alex's appearance, Alex had been carrying the weight of combat experience that included dozens of successful missions in the world's most dangerous places. Jessica's phone buzzed with notifications, messages from friends, family members, and even strangers who'd connected her social media accounts to the hashtag Thrift Store Girl campaign that had now become a cautionary tale about the dangers of superficial judgment. Her father, whose corporate connections had seemed so impressive just days earlier, had called to express his disappointment in her behavior and its reflection on the Hamilton family name. Brandon Torres was dealing with his own reckoning. The family media empire that had given him such confidence about his understanding of crisis management now seemed embarrassingly shallow compared to Alex's real-world experience managing actual crises where failure meant death rather than bad publicity. He'd spent Sunday morning deleting social media posts and videos, but the internet had already archived everything. His mockery of a decorated combat veteran was now permanently documented, a digital reminder of how badly he'd misjudged someone whose competence far exceeded his own privileged background. Riley Matthews faced perhaps the harshest judgment of all. As the daughter of a State Department official, she'd grown up around diplomatic and military personnel. She should have recognized the signs of real expertise, the quiet confidence that comes from genuine experience rather than inherited authority. Her mother had seen the news coverage and demanded a full explanation of Riley's role in the harassment campaign. "You mocked a war hero, someone who's risked her life for diplomatic personnel like the ones I work with every day. How could you not recognize what she was?" But the most profound impact was felt by those who'd witnessed Alex's leadership during the campus emergency. Sarah, the pre-med student, had been inspired to research military medical corps training. Marcus Kim was considering a career change toward emergency management, recognizing the difference between theoretical knowledge and practical competence. Dr. Rodriguez had spent the weekend reviewing the crisis response, marveling at how effectively Alex had organized resources and personnel with no official authority beyond her obvious competence. She'd written a detailed report to the university administration recommending changes to their emergency protocols based on Alex's impromptu innovations. Professor Mitchell faced the most professional soul-searching. His crisis management course, which had seemed so comprehensive in academic terms, had been revealed as woefully inadequate when compared to real-world crisis leadership. He'd spent Sunday revising his curriculum, incorporating lessons learned from watching actual competence under pressure. Monday morning brought Alex's return to campus, though not in the way anyone expected. She arrived not in military helicopters, but in the same modest car she'd driven all semester, wearing the same type of simple clothes that had triggered so much mockery. But everything about the campus reception was different. Students stopped what they were doing to watch her walk across the quad. Some approached to offer thanks for her service. Others simply nodded respectfully. The casual dismissal she'd faced for 3 days had been replaced by something approaching reverence. Alex seemed unchanged by the attention. She walked with the same quiet confidence she'd always displayed, acknowledged greetings politely, but didn't seek attention or validation. She was as she'd always been, focused on her own mission rather than others' opinions.
In crisis management class, the atmosphere was completely transformed. Professor Mitchell had restructured the entire course around practical crisis leadership rather than theoretical frameworks. Alex found herself in the unprecedented position of being asked to guest lecture about real-world emergency management. Leadership, she told the class, standing at the front of the lecture hall where she'd once been mocked, isn't about commanding respect through authority or credentials. It's about earning trust through competence and character. When people are scared, confused, or in danger, they don't care about your background or your appearance. They care about whether you can keep them safe. She looked around the room at faces that regarded her with new understanding. The most important lesson from this week isn't about emergency management protocols or military tactics. It's about the danger of making assumptions about people based on superficial observations. Competence doesn't announce itself with expensive clothes or impressive titles. It simply performs when performance is required. Jessica Hamilton raised her hand from the back of the room, her voice tentative. "Captain Chen, Alex, how do we make sure we don't make the same mistakes again?" Alex considered the question carefully. By remembering that everyone you meet knows something you don't, has experienced something you haven't, and may be exactly the person you need when everything falls apart.
Judge people by their actions, not their appearances. Value competence over credentials, and never assume that quiet confidence means someone has nothing important to offer. As the semester continued, Alex remained the same person she'd always been: studious, quiet, focused on learning rather than impressing others. But the campus community had fundamentally changed in how they saw her, and more importantly, how they evaluated others. The hashtag thrift store girl hashtag had evolved into something entirely different. A reminder about the danger of superficial judgment and the importance of recognizing worth in all its forms. Alex's story became part of Riverside University's culture, a permanent lesson about leadership, competence, and the courage to step forward when others step back. She graduated quietly as she lived her time there, but her impact on the campus community was permanent. Students who'd witnessed her leadership during the crisis and her grace during the revelation carried those lessons into their own careers in business, government, and military service. And sometimes, when new students arrived at Riverside University thinking they understood leadership and competence and worth, older students would tell them the story of the quiet girl in thrift store clothes who turned out to be exactly what everyone needed when everything fell apart. The story of Captain Alexander Chen, callsign Phoenix, who'd proven that true leadership doesn't need to announce itself. It simply steps forward when stepping forward is required. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.